Okay, guys, hello again. It is the beginning of the week for Unit 5, and I wanted to talk a little bit about a topic that had come up last week or the week before in a discussion I had with a student, one of your colleagues here in the class. And it's about the field of strategic communication. And I want to have an abbreviated version of a conversation I have with my in-person students here at American University. And I have it every year in the fall when I start teaching a new class of graduate students. Um, so this will be a one-sided conversation. But I want to cover a few things, talk a little bit about our field more broadly. And I'm not sure to what degree this is news to you. What I'm about to tell you is new, and I hope it's interesting and worthwhile. But some of you might already understand and know this material. But in conversations I had, I got the sense that for a few people this would be new. And so I want to talk about the field of strategic communication broadly for just a few minutes. I view myself as teaching and doing research within the field of strategic communication. So what does that mean? What does that term mean? It is an overarching umbrella term that I use to describe a broad array of academic disciplines as well as professional practices, professional fields. And it is a term that is used more and more for a variety of reasons. In the past, I think the overarching umbrella term might have been the term public relations. That is, people in public relations felt that their field was the overarching idea, the overarching umbrella that subsumed everything else underneath it. I don't think there's many people who think that anymore. I also know that for some people who work in business, in schools of business or the field of business, they might put the term marketing at the top, and they view everything else as falling under the term of marketing or even social marketing, probably marketing. So the understanding that I'm going to give you, the way I understand our field, is a popular one. It's widely held, but it's not exclusively held. There are other people who organize our academic and professional fields differently, and that reflects their own training, their own background, their own emphasis, etc. Um, and the example I just gave, that if you come from a business background, you might place marketing or advertising more preeminent. But this is how I organize the field. And as I said, a lot of people, other people do as well. In addition, you should understand that people will use some of these terms interchangeably. So the term strategic communication can be used to mean just plain public relations to some people, or in government specifically, it might mean something quite different. So strategic communication, or STRATCOM, in the military is something kind of different than what we talk about here. And that's fine. It's okay. There is this little bit of confusion in our field and in our understanding. But you should understand that. You might be talking to somebody someday and they say something to you like, I work in STRATCOM, and you're talking to them and asking questions, and you come to think to yourself, that's not STRATCOM as I understand it. And you might perfectly well be right. There are these differences in understanding. Um, okay. So here's the outline you can see on the screen here of how I sort of understand the world. Under the umbrella of strategic communication, which is purposeful, goal-directed communication. Having the goal, having the plan, having the objectives make it strategic. It has very clear goals and tactics for reaching those goals. And that sort of strategic thinking is something that I think our students really get from a graduate program. It's what you should get. It's an understanding of the importance of strategy in directing your tactics, which are the individual things that you do each day. And for those of you who work, which is many of you, you are well aware of the experience of working for an organization that is not very strategic. This can be a loaded question to ask at the next big meeting you have in your office, but to sit back and to say to somebody, to say to your boss, what is the overarching goal here? What are we trying to do? And are the day-to-day tasks we do serving that goal? That is strategic thinking. And I know plenty of organizations don't think that way, but I hope that you go forward out of this program with appreciating the importance of strategic thinking. Okay, so for me, the big player in this chart you see in front of you is public relations. What I mean by that is that employs, I think, probably employs the most people. We can maybe argue on that point, but I think it does. And public relations itself has changed dramatically in the past 20, 30 years. one of the hugest changes, the biggest changes, is that in PR now we have the ability to communicate directly with our audience to a far greater degree than we ever did. 30 or 40 years ago, PR was working through the media to reach your goals. Now, of course, I have many, many former students in PR who never deal with the media or the mainstream media. They have websites and email lists and Twitter feeds, etc., that go directly to the audience they want to talk to. That's a huge change in how PR is practiced and how strategic communication is practiced. And to my thinking, it makes our work much more interesting, much more engaging. And across these fields, it's true for many of them. In health communication and marketing and public affairs, often communicating directly with your audience, not having to communicate through the mainstream media, newspapers, broadcasting, etc. So we also define public relations today much more in line with managing relationships between audiences or aligning the goals of your organization with its publics or audiences or something like that. Management typically plays a role, audience plays a role in how we define and think about PR. Whereas decades ago we thought about PR as publicity, getting attention for my organization, my cause, my client. And that is not really a modern definition of PR anymore. Okay, so under public relations, we have all sorts of fields that you might find yourself working in, such as media relations, which is dealing with the press, media advocacy, which is really its own sort of interesting subfield. It has to do with getting attention for an organization. Internal communication. I always have plenty of students working internally, especially with big organizations which have large internal communication apparatus. They have internal magazines, newsletters. They might have an audience in the tens of thousands. If you work for Ford Motor Company, 100,000 or more, however many people work for Ford. And for them, you might handle all of the internal communication, which is an enormous job. Then event planning, and this is thinking of events that work toward the strategic goal of an organization. So I always have a student or two each year very interested in event planning, and that's part of, I think, PR is where I put it here. Investor relations is a subset, really a subfield of PR, which is mostly for publicly traded companies. You see a lot of people who come out of business backgrounds or even legal backgrounds who work in investor relations. And then down here at the bottom, and I'll circle it right here with my pointer, sports comm, entertainment communication, international PR, litigation PR, consumer lifestyle PR, all these sort of subfields of public relations. And I think increasingly we're able to define these fields as being distinctly different in interesting ways than generally practiced public relations. I've had graduate students in the past couple of years write capstone papers about hospital public relations, or another very interesting idea was museum public relations, and how museums differ in unique ways that makes their particular brand of PR interesting and challenging and different. So PR for me is the big dog. Moving to the other side of this diagram, up at the top we have crisis communication. Most of you know what that is, how we quickly respond to a crisis. I think that kind of communication still is largely practiced through mainstream media, although you can think of Twitter feeds and emails also being used to get information about crises out. Risk communication is a field you might not have heard about. Increasingly interesting, increasingly understood by professionals. Risk communication is this. It is getting you to be afraid of things that you should be afraid about and getting you to be calm about things that you should be calm about. In other words, how do you get people to be alarmed about global warming, but not so alarmed that they're paralyzed into fear? How do you get people to be alarmed about the risk of cancer, alarmed enough that they will go to their doctors and get checked the way we should all get checked, but not so alarmed that they're paralyzed by fear? How do you get people to evacuate safely when a hurricane is approaching or a tornado is approaching? And that is, how do we properly and correctly notify people about the risk in their lives? This is an area that's increasingly political. When you talk about issues like vaccinations, like climate change, even something like evolution, whatever, evolution maybe not a great example, but vaccination and climate change. How do you get people to vaccinate their kids? Because you should vaccinate your children. And at the same time, how do you notify them properly about the risks involved and all sorts of things? So very interesting field, very interesting, and conceptually distinct from crisis communication. They are related, but clearly distinct. We see here at the top then intercultural communication, communicating across cultures. Right underneath that is health communication, which involves everything from teaching people about the risks of smoking to studying the communication between a doctor and a patient. It is a huge field. It is well funded. It is at every major medical school in the country. They have a large departments of health communication, and it is really important because if you can get people to eat less fatty foods or drink or smoke fewer cigarettes or drink less sugary food, it has immediate and dramatic impacts on health. And so there's huge. The stakes are very high in health communication. Again, well funded by both government and foundations. It's a great field to get into. It's very interesting. Then you have marketing, which is a field that arises largely from business. Under that, we have advertising, social marketing, which is the field of trying to sell ideas in the same way you sell soap. Can you use marketing techniques to sell ideas or candidates or organizations and things like that? I'll skip experiential marketing. You can look that one up. Then government work. Under that is public affairs, public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is a completely separate field. It is communicating with international audiences, and it's typically done via our government. And then fields of government relations and lobbying. And then the field of political communication, which is a distinct field here at the university and also a distinct field professionally practiced, especially here in Washington. Political advertising, political PR is a separate field, which is fairly new, and political advocacy. Under government work, you saw public affairs, and I also mentioned to you that the military publishes strategic communication. And the reasons why, at least one of the reasons why, we have these two extra terms is because of the term public relations, which has a connotation that is it has a negative connotation. Because of that, some places, like the government, don't use the term public relations. They use the term public affairs or strategic communication. So our field is remarkably broad. It is remarkably diverse. This degree qualifies you to work across all of these fields. And yet I also tell students, if you move into public diplomacy or health communication, you now have a lot of homework in front of you, which is great and exciting and interesting. But it is not an easy road to hoe. There's a lot here. There's a lot to know. And one of the things I will really encourage of you in closing here, and a conversation that I have in my classroom, is that you need to begin to define yourself what your field is and be able to explain and defend it. And this is most easily illustrated by thinking of public relations. So if you're interested in public relations, I know some of you are, what is it? You have to have an answer to that question, at least to yourself. Don't worry about it being the perfect answer to everybody, but what is PR to you? Why is it valuable? What is it that you offer to an organization or a cause or a business? These are important things that you want to answer to yourself most importantly. Why do I do this? Why is it valuable? Why is it worthwhile? And then if you work in public relations, the next question is, what about the negative aspects of the field? Aren't you guys in PR, aren't you all spinmeisters? Don't you just lie when you have to? And no, we don't. and no, we are engaged in an honorable profession, an ethical profession that gives real value and has real importance to a democratic society. Now, be prepared for that question. Be thinking about it, because when you're thinking about it, you're thinking about your career and what your career is and why you want to do what you want to do. So again, in the classroom, it's easier to have these conversations, but I really encourage you to think about it and to talk about it. This too is part of our graduate education. Think about where we fit and where we belong, and which of these fields, these many, many fields, interests us. Okay, so I'm going to post this discussion under the student lounge. I hope you find it worthwhile. I wish we could have this conversation face-to-face. Perhaps in future classes I will try to arrange to have this discussion face-to-face with students. That's it. Please, I'd love to hear your comments on it. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. And I especially hope that I get you thinking about this a little bit. And that's it. Have a good Unit 5, and I will see you online. Thanks.